Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. We've got the hottest, most shocking story for you today, one that's making waves across the nation. Stay tuned, hit that like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to help us keep bringing the truth to light. Let's dive in. The night before the highly anticipated interview, something felt off. The air in Washington, D.C. was thick, electric, as if the city itself knew a storm was coming. Inside a dimly lit, soundproofed boardroom, a group of powerful figures sat in silence, their faces illuminated only by the flickering glow of a massive screen. On it, JD Vance's face was displayed, frozen mid-speech. "He won't survive this," a shadowed figure murmured, swirling a glass of whiskey in his hand. From a different corner, a woman's voice cut through the darkness. "Caldwell has his orders. He knows what to do." Miles away, JD Vance sat in his hotel suite, staring out the window. The White House gleamed in the distance, but his mind wasn't on the view. His instincts, sharpened by years in the Marine Corps, screamed that this wasn't going to be an ordinary interview. Something deeper was at play. He turned to his security advisor. "Any updates?" His advisor checked his phone. "Nothing yet. But I don't like how quiet it's been. Feels like someone's laying a trap." Vance exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Then let them try." Meanwhile, inside the cold, sterile control room of the broadcasting studio, Sophia Reynolds, the show's executive producer, was finalizing last-minute details. Her hands hovered over the console, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew the plan. She knew Caldwell's orders. But deep inside, something gnawed at her, an unease she couldn't shake. She glanced at the countdown timer. 1 hour until the show. Little did they all know, this wouldn't just be an interview. It would be a reckoning. The studio buzzed with a nervous energy. The air was thick with anticipation, but there was something else beneath it, something darker. JD Vance walked onto the set with the unshakable confidence of a man who had seen battle before, but even he could feel the weight in the room. The lights blazed hotter than usual, the cameras lingered on his face for just a second too long, and Caldwell, the host, had that same smug look predators wore before they struck. Sophia Reynolds, the show's executive producer, stood behind the control panel, fingers twitching. She had orchestrated 100 interviews before, but this wasn't an interview, it was an execution. And yet, somewhere deep inside, she wasn't sure who was walking into whose trap. Caldwell leaned forward, his lips curling into a practiced smirk. "Mr. Vice President," he began, his voice dripping with artificial warmth, "you've had quite the journey, haven't you? From vocal Trump critic to his second-in-command. Tell me, how does it feel to betray your own ideals?" The crowd, hand-selected, hand-scripted, laughed on cue, their reactions carefully planned to chip away at Vance's composure. But he didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled. "You know, Caldwell," he said, his voice steady, "that's actually a great question. But before I answer it, let me ask you something. Have you ever changed your mind about something after learning the truth?" A ripple of silence passed through the studio. Caldwell's smirk flickered, just for a second. He hadn't expected that. Vance's eyes darkened slightly, like a hunter waiting for his prey to make a move. Because real wisdom, Caldwell, isn't about clinging to an opinion for the sake of pride. It's about growth. And I think we both know that. The crowd murmured. Sophia's grip on the control panel tightened. Something was happening. The plan was shifting. And the ambush? It had just begun, but not in the way Caldwell had hoped. Caldwell's grip on his interview cards tightened, his knuckles going white as he realized he had underestimated JD Vance. The studio, once a controlled battlefield designed for a public takedown, was now tilting in the vice president's favor. The audience, hand-picked to jeer, to mock, to apply social pressure, was suddenly unsure. They had expected a cornered man, a desperate politician scrambling to justify himself. Instead, they saw a man standing firm, unshaken, turning the very weapons against his attacker. Sophia Reynolds, the executive producer, could feel the energy shift from her position behind the cameras. Her chest tightened. Caldwell was supposed to lead this interview, to dictate the terms, but it was becoming increasingly clear who was truly in control. Caldwell forced a laugh, his showman's mask cracking slightly. "All right, Mr. Vice President, let's talk about something less philosophical and more real. Your speech at the National Prayer Breakfast, some say it blurred the lines between church and state. Isn't it dangerous for someone in your position to bring religion into government?" Vance's gaze didn't waver. If anything, his posture became even more unshakable. "Dangerous?" he echoed, tilting his head slightly. "Caldwell, when I took my oath of office, I placed my hand on the Bible. Every president and vice president before me has done the same. Was that dangerous, too?" Caldwell hesitated. "That wasn't in the script." "I'll tell you what is dangerous," Vance continued, his voice steady but laced with steel. "It's pretending that faith has no place in leadership. Our founding fathers didn't fear religion. They feared tyranny. And let's be honest, Caldwell, you and I both know that tyranny isn't always loud. Sometimes, it comes wrapped in polite questions designed to shame people out of their beliefs." A slow murmur spread through the crowd. Caldwell swallowed. Sophia Reynolds' breath hitched. Vance wasn't just answering questions. He was taking the fight straight to them. The tension in the studio had reached a fever pitch. Caldwell, who had entered this interview expecting to corner JD Vance, now found himself losing control of the narrative. His usual smirk, the arrogant gleam in his eyes, had all but vanished. Sophia Reynolds, the executive producer, stood rigid behind the cameras, gripping her headset as if sheer force could salvage the situation. The audience, once expected to be hostile, was now watching in stunned silence, their collective breath held as if sensing they were witnessing something historic. Caldwell shuffled his cue cards, desperate for a way to regain control. His voice came out sharper now, more forced. "Let's not dance around it, Mr. Vice President. You've gone from an outspoken critic of President Trump to his right-hand man. How do you expect people to believe that isn't pure political opportunism?" Vance leaned forward, his presence commanding, his voice unwavering. "Caldwell, have you ever changed your mind about someone after seeing them in action? Or do you believe that once you form an opinion, it must remain unchanged for life?" Caldwell blinked, caught off guard. Vance continued, his tone like a blade slicing through the silence. "I judged Donald Trump before I ever met him, before I ever saw what his policies did for working Americans. Then I saw factories reopening, wages rising, families getting a second chance at the American dream. What kind of man would I be if I ignored that just to appease people like you?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sophia Reynolds whispered frantically into her headset, but there was no stopping the shift in energy now. Vance leaned back, his eyes locking on to Caldwell's with an almost eerie calm. "You call it opportunism. I call it wisdom. The real question is, what do you call refusing to admit when you're wrong?" For the first time all night, Caldwell had no answer. Banda noi. Dua veo tom tat tren viet don van 302 cho y5, tiang on my. ChatGPT de noi. The collapse, a moment of reckoning. The air in the studio had turned electric, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. Caldwell, once the predator in this arena, now looked like prey. His usual air of smug superiority had crumbled under the sheer force of JD Vance's unwavering confidence. Behind the cameras, Sophia Reynolds, the executive producer, was no longer giving directions, she was frozen, staring at the unfolding disaster like a captain watching her ship sink in real time. Caldwell licked his lips, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He forced a chuckle, an attempt to regain his composure. "Mr. Vice President, it's easy to sit here and rewrite history. But let's talk about the real issue, your so-called traditional values. Some would say they are outdated, even dangerous in today's modern world. Vance didn't flinch. He turned to the audience, his gaze steady, unshaken. Let's talk about that, then. His voice was measured, but there was steel beneath it. Let's talk about the people who built this country. The men and women who believed in faith, family, and freedom. The ones who fought wars, worked double shifts, and sacrificed so their children could have a better future. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. People sat up straighter, listening. Vance's voice grew stronger. And now, people like you, Caldwell, sit in your polished studios and mock those values, values that have carried generations through hardship. You call them outdated? No, sir. They are the foundation of everything we stand for. Caldwell opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His face, once so confident, had gone pale. Vance smiled slightly. You came here thinking you could expose me. But all you've done, Caldwell, is expose your own contempt for the people who make this country great. The studio erupted in applause. And just like that, the balance of power had shifted, for good. The studio was no longer Caldwell's battleground. The walls that once echoed with his voice now carried the weight of JD Vance's undeniable presence. Sophia Reynolds, the executive producer, was gripping the control panel, her knuckles white, her carefully crafted show slipping through her fingers. She had planned for a spectacle, just not this one. Caldwell, cornered and exposed, attempted one last desperate move. He forced a smirk, shaking his head as if the entire conversation had been a mere game. Mr. Vice President, it's easy to grandstand, to rally a crowd, but let's be honest, this isn't about values or faith. This is about power. You're just another politician who changed his tune for a seat in Washington. The words hit the air like a dying ember, weak, flickering, and easily snuffed out. Vance leaned forward, his voice low, deliberate. You call it power, he said, his eyes locked onto Caldwell's. I call it duty. The duty to serve the people, not to sit in a studio and talk down to them. He gestured to the audience, whose faces had transformed from passive spectators to engaged participants. These are the Americans you mock. The ones you pretend don't exist. But they are here. And they are listening. A hush fell over the room. Caldwell swallowed hard. His usual arsenal, sarcasm, deflection, arrogance, had failed him. Then came the final blow. You want to talk about power? Vance continued, his voice like steel. Real power doesn't come from a studio chair. It comes from standing firm in what you believe, even when people like you try to tear it down. The audience rose to their feet, applause thundering through the studio. Caldwell was silent, defeated. He had walked in thinking he would expose JD Vance. But the only thing exposed tonight was himself. As JD Vance rose from his chair, the atmosphere in the studio shifted from tense confrontation to something almost surreal. The standing ovation didn't die down, it grew, wave after wave of applause, a declaration from the audience that they had just witnessed something historic. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second, every expression, every moment that would soon be dissected across news cycles and social media. Caldwell remained seated, frozen in place. His usual bravado had evaporated, replaced by something between disbelief and humiliation. He had walked into this interview with every intention of making JD Vance crumble under pressure. Instead, he had been the one dismantled, his carefully constructed media persona cracked wide open for the world to see. Sophia Reynolds, still gripping her headset in the control room, stared at the screen in stunned silence. She had orchestrated countless high-profile interviews, but never had she lost control like this. Never had she seen a guest seize a moment so completely, so effortlessly. Vance turned to the camera, his expression calm but unshakable. To every American watching tonight, know this, your faith, your values, your voice matter. No amount of media spin or political games can take that away from you. The words rang through the studio, final and absolute. Caldwell had nothing left to say. As JD Vance walked off set, the cameras lingered on him for just a second longer, his presence still looming even after he had gone. The broadcast had started as an ambush. It had ended as a reckoning. And by the time the credits rolled, one truth was undeniable: this wasn't just another political interview. This was a turning point. 4-0.